Hello, everyone. I want to apologize once again for all the difficulties we've been having. There's been some issue with Blackboard and our course with the recordings. They have just been disappearing and haven't been showing up. And so hopefully that will be fixed in the next couple of days, and we'll be able to resume regular interactions. So I want to cover a couple of things. In this video, we're going to cover some material from last Wednesday's class on methods, and then I'll also be posting as soon as I can a video from Monday's class related to finding sources for a research paper. So in general, we're still looking at an overview of research. When we begin talking about finding sources, we'll be much more specific in looking at practical types of approaches to investigating that information. When it comes to thinking about research in general, though, there are essentially two different types of research. One which we might call quantitative, and which we would call qualitative. Quantitative research refers to research that can be expressed in numbers or is concerned with amounts. And so it involves measurements, standards of measurements. The results are expressed in numbers. And so we're talking about things like surveys. We're talking about, investigating like standards like rulers or thermometers kind of thing. That's essentially what quantitative research amounts to. In many respects, a lot of the research that you will do either as a student in the program or when you are involved in like a ministry type of situation will not be quantitative. Now, if you're doing a congregational study or some sort of a study like that where you're wanting to get information about the demographics, the makeup of a congregation, then you're going to use some quantitative methods. But in most cases, what you'll be doing is predominantly the other type of research, which is qualitative. Qualitative research usually refers to investigations where you're examining characteristics that are not reducible to numbers. You're talking about qualities, complex situations, things that are not easy to quantify. And so in thinking about that, we're talking about, like a historical study. We're talking about, the meaning of texts. Right? These you don't really put a number to them. I mean, certainly you can do biblical studies research, which would ask, for example, the number of times that Paul uses the term faith in Romans. But once you have that, so what's the so what, right? Your research is going to be more than that. You're essentially trying to say there's something significant, for example, about the number of times. And that's more of a qualitative type of approach. Qualitative research projects tend to look to describe and explain. Not that necessarily quantitative don't, but again, the number issue is the one that predominates when we're talking about quantitative research. In qualitative research, you're looking to explore and interpret. These are the kind of things that you're trying to accomplish. Is not necessarily measuring, right? And so there's a difference here between these two types. And as I mentioned, quantitative is not really one that you're going to be involved in. No matter what research method type you're using, a very important component of research and any sort of research project is the use of critical thinking. And essentially what you're doing in critical thinking is evaluating the accuracy, the credibility, the worth of information. Is this information valuable to my project? And investigating lines of reasoning and using lines of reasoning to come to conclusions. Critical thinking is a very important part of research because as you do research, you're going to come across a variety of information. And you have to make some determinations about what is useful, what is not. You have to make some determinations about whether certain things are accurate or not. And then you also have to be able to follow the reasoning of what an author or a set of authors is saying. And critical thinking, of course, is very important in religious matters anyway, in that there's so much information about religion and the Bible out there that we have to be critical thinkers to examine the questions, to examine this information and determine whether it's accurate or not. In thinking about this, there are a couple of different examples or exercises that you might be involved in when doing this in the context of research. One aspect might be an argument analysis. So thinking about, let's say, your papers are supposed to be on these biblical texts, and some of which are challenging texts. So here you have somebody who's trying to make a claim that this is the way to interpret this particular passage. Let's use our example of the woman taking an adultery passage. So someone is trying to make the case that it doesn't belong in John chapter 8. So argument analysis would be investigating the reasons, the evidence that they are putting forward to make this claim, and saying, do these reasons support this claim? Is this sufficient to conclude this with some bit of accuracy? Probabilistic reasoning is another type of critical thinking that might be useful at times. Given a set of conditions, what is the likely outcome? This is probably the case that, given a set of criteria, and so this is what it is like in a certain place at a certain time. So it is likely that this took place, or that this might be what is being addressed. And so what's the probability that certain things are true, or certain things that are going to happen? Decision making is, of course, should be a matter of critical thinking, examining alternatives, thinking about which is the best course of action given a reasonable examination, as opposed to which feels the best, which wouldn't necessarily be critical thinking. And then another would be hypothesis testing. That's another type of critical thinking, right? So we have a hypothesis about a certain situation, and so we would investigate, is this a logical hypothesis given the situations? What kind of impact does this hypothesis have on a particular project? Are these conclusions valid based on this hypothesis? All of these are examples of critical thinking. Very important to critical thinking and to research in general is logical reasoning. In thinking about thinking, we have to recognize that one important component of critical thinking related to research is how to reach certain conclusions, which should be a logical process and not just what feels to be accurate. And so when it comes to reasoning, there are a couple of different approaches. First is the deductive or inductive approach. The inductive approach essentially investigates particulars, right, certain instances of something, and then draws general principles, right? And so based on these observations of this particular event or this particular occurrence, this is a general principle about those things. Deductive reasoning works the opposite way. Deductive reasoning starts with a general principle and then works through to conclusions about particulars. So you're kind of, you're trying to, in inductive reasoning, you're trying to develop a general principle because of certain situations. In deductive reasoning, you have a general principle, and you are logically reasoning what is the conclusion of that given another set of criteria. Now, there are also ways in which reasoning can become problematic, can be unhelpful, actually, and we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Let's give a couple examples of these different types of reasoning. So first, deductive reasoning. And this is probably something you've encountered before, maybe not under this term, but something we probably all do, whether we're conscious of it or not. So deductive reasoning would be what's sometimes referred to as syllogism or syllogistic reasoning. So we have this general principle: all people are mortal. Socrates is a person, and so our major premise is all people are mortal. Our minor premise is Socrates is a person. So the conclusion is Socrates is mortal. Right? So if all people are mortal and Socrates is a person, then Socrates is mortal. Right? So moving from the general down to the specific. Inductive reasoning, again, operates the other way. So, for example, if I wanted to know what the Bible taught about baptism, and I'm going to inductively reason this, I'm going to start with looking at all the ways that baptism is talked about in Scripture. All right? And so that might be start with a concordance search and begin investigating the words baptism, baptize, other words that would be similar. And I find all of those passages. Then I would pay attention to what is said in those passages, what is said in the context around those passages. I would, make careful observations of all those passages and make detailed observations, and then draw out some general conclusions. Given these specific situations, what appears to be the case about what the Bible teaches about baptism. All right, so I'm reasoning from the particular to the general. Now, it seems pretty simple, but there are some pitfalls or some difficulties that someone can fall into. There are also ways in which there's a limit to inductive and deductive reasoning, and so we have to be careful that we are doing inductive or deductive reasoning or any sort of logical process in very careful ways. One thing might be starting off with a faulty premise. If you start off with a faulty premise, you're going to you could reach a bad conclusion, right? And so if you start wrong, you could end up wrong. So for example, right, we have our syllogism, and we start with the premise that the earth is flat. Right? So our major premise is the earth that's flat. Our minor premise is that objects that reach the edge of flat surfaces fall off. Right? The earth is flat. Objects that reach the ends of flat surfaces fall off. Therefore, ships that reach the edge of the earth will fall off. Now, the reasoning process is accurate. The problem is we have started from a bad position. Right? So because we have started from a faulty premise, we are going to reach an inaccurate conclusion. So one way that reasoning is limited is if we don't have the right general principles for deductive reasoning. Secondly, we might not observe or gather enough information. And if we do this, then we could reach wrong conclusions as well. So if every apple I see is red and tastes sweet, and I draw the conclusion that all apples are red and taste sweet, I've reached the wrong conclusion. And this is due to the fact that I haven't gathered enough information, right? Because there's a lot of other apples that are out there that I just don't have access to or whatever reason, and so I've drawn a principle based on inaccurate information. So we can start with a faulty premise. You can not gather enough information. And so if you start with a faulty premise, that's going to affect your deductive reasoning. If you don't have enough information, that's going to affect your inductive reasoning. And then also, you might not engage in the appropriate types of reasoning. And so if you reason improperly, you're also going to end up with bad information or bad conclusions. So back to our syllogism about Socrates. We start with a general principle. All people are mortal. Okay? Perfectly good general principle. Nothing wrong with the premise. Socrates is a person. Right? So far, we have enough information. Right? We're just concerned about Socrates. So I draw the conclusion that all people are Socrates. Well, that's faulty reasoning. Right? That line of reasoning doesn't work. And so, there's all sorts of ways that we can mess up the reasoning process, where we end up with inaccurate conclusions. And so, the reasoning process can be limited.